So there's going to be quite a lot of overlap between what Coralie's just talked to you about and what I'm here to talk to you about, which makes sense because Coralie has invited me to be here today. So I've been asked to talk about the contents of a paper that has come out recently by myself and my co-author, Daniel Nettle, about the behavioural constellation of deprivation, which is a cluster of behaviours similar to that which Coralie has spoken about, which we believe we can detect an underlying thread in terms of how those behaviours might play out and why. I'm going to, this is a behavioural and brain sciences paper, so I'm going to talk about mostly what is in the target article, but of course there were a lot of commentaries on this. We got 31 commentaries, including one from Coralie. And so if there's time at the end, I'm also going to highlight some of the most interesting responses that we got to this paper and pull out some of the key points from them, particularly because a lot of them were about policy making, and we're supposed to be talking about that scale today. Before I talk to you about what is the behavioural constellation of deprivation, I want to talk a little bit about socioeconomic status, because when I'm talking about deprivation in this paper, what we really are talking about is the attempt to capture something meaningful about the experience of being less well off, than others in society. So just to talk a little bit about socioeconomic status, so most of the relationships that I'm going to talk to you about today are between socioeconomic status and some behaviour or other. And often when we measure socioeconomic status, we use income or personal wealth, we use education or occupation, we're using a variety of things, and it's not necessarily because we think something like education per se is going to be causally related to an outcome of interest, but we're using it as a proxy to try and capture whether or not a person is likely to be in what I would call an environment of socioeconomic deprivation. So just really to flag up the idea that although I'm talking about relationships between socioeconomic status and behaviour, what I'm really saying is that people of lower SES tend to live in a certain type of ecology, and that ecology is going to drive behaviours that I would like to talk about. Now there's a range of other measures that I've not mentioned here. These are the most sort of classical measures of SES, but we often see people use area level measures, so sort of we can have area indices of deprivation. That's a particularly prevalently used one in the UK. And also slightly sort of quirky individual things like car ownership are often used as an indicator of socioeconomic status. But as I say, it's not those things per se that we think have a causal relationship with behaviour. So what is it about being lower or higher SES that drives differences in behaviour? And why is this interesting? So before I go into what I think drives the differences in behaviour, I'm just going to talk about why we might be interested in that. Why is it important? And one of those things is that there are quite stark socioeconomic differences in life expectancy. So in my hometown of Newcastle upon Tyne, men in the poorest areas of Newcastle can expect on average to live 14 years fewer than men in the wealthiest areas. For women, this difference is around 11 years. Now that's quite a stark difference considering that these are all people in the same city, in the same country. And you know, we see smaller differences between countries in terms of average life expectancy. So it's not a trivial issue. And depending on where you look in the public health literature, the things that cause this difference in behaviour are this difference in health, in health outcomes, are about half due to behaviour. And those leading causes of premature mortality. Now this data is from a paper that looked at causes of death in the US in the year 2000. Include tobacco use, poor diet and physical inactivity, and alcohol consumption. So these are all things that in the US have been contributing quite meaningful proportions to premature mortality, and that are in fact entirely avoidable behaviours. They're things that individuals choose to do that are clearly contributing to early mortality. So there's a big question and a conundrum in public health as to why some of the people who are worse off in society would also exacerbate their problems by adopting these behaviours more so than other people. And so in the paper that I'm talking about today, we identify what we have termed a behavioural constellation of deprivation. Now this includes many of the behaviours that Coralie was talking about with reference to life history strategies. But it also includes things like tendencies towards savings and debt. Now, it may seem fairly obvious that if you are less well off, that if you have a lower income, you should have fewer savings and perhaps more debt. But indeed, at both the individual and the household level, people in lower SES households tend to save a lower proportion of their income as well. Investment in education, Coralie has already talked about a little bit, and reproductive timing, she's covered plenty, so I'll skip over that. Parental investment tends to be lower in people of lower SES, and that includes a range of things like spending time with children, also breastfeeding, taking interest in their education, and so forth. It includes the health behaviours that I've just covered, other health behaviours including recreational drug use, uptake of free screening when it is offered, and more health behaviours. I mean, I could go on for a while, but things like tendency to take up free dental treatment and use of seatbelts in cars. These are all things that are covered in the public health literature. And what we've argued in our paper is that all of these things can be understood in terms of a common thread. So that common thread being trade-offs between present and future. So most obviously, if you save money now, for the future, you cannot spend it now. And if you get into debt now, you're paying that off in the future and you're enjoying whatever credit you've accrued in the present. Similarly, investment in education is investment in future outcomes. And a lot of these health behaviours that I'm talking about involve a trade-off. Maybe you forego something pleasant in the present in order to enjoy better health later on, or maybe you put effort into something that's unpleasant in the present, such as physical activity, or it's unpleasant for some anyway, in order to enjoy a healthier, longer life. Now, these things that we've put into the constellation, I'm not saying that we're trying with this explanation of present-future trade-offs to explain all behaviours that are socioeconomically patterned, but we have defined our constellation as these things which come together with lower SES and can also be understood through this trade-off between present and future outcomes. And inherent in this, there's a lot in the literature about concepts related to present-future trade-offs. So there are concepts such as temporal discounting and its converse, ability to delay gratification, consideration of future consequences, future and present orientation, and these all tend to be kind of lumped together in the literature and variously put under the banner of impulsivity. Now, just to point out, because I want you to come away with an idea of why it should make a difference to take the perspective that I'm going to outline, so I just want to highlight some of the current prevalent perspectives in the literature on present-future trade-offs, so that I can point out to you why I would think about them slightly differently. So this is quite a high-profile science paper by Haushofer and Fair, and just to say, I do actually really like this paper, but they took an immediate stance. This is a passage from the abstract, to say that the evidence indicates that poverty causes stress and negative affective states, which in turn may lead to short-sighted and risk-averse decision-making, possibly by limiting attention and favouring habitual behaviours at the expense of goal-directed ones. So immediately they're suggesting that somehow stress leads to poor decision-making through sort of negative affect, and that perhaps there's a kind of a deficit perspective. They're assuming that people who are behaving in a present-oriented manner are somehow deficient in their thinking. There's poor reasoning. And you see this in the neuroscience literature as well. So this is a quote from Barry and Robbins, saying that deficient inhibitory processes profoundly affect everyday life, causing impulsive conduct which is generally detrimental to the individual. So again, there is that assumption that being present-oriented is going to be bad for you, or that it's not the best possible course of action for the individual. And what I would argue is that that depends upon the context that you're in. And so what is it about a lower SES ecology that might mean your context is different? Well, for one thing, being low SES by default entails reduced personal control. So most obviously, it entails a lesser ability to purchase solutions to your problems. And less obviously, it entails perhaps having fewer powerful social connections. Now, I've taken a really cartoon example here. This is Jared Kushner, who is the senior advisor to Donald Trump and also happens to be his son-in-law. In this particular case, having a powerful social connection has done a very useful thing for him in his life. I mean, Obviously, this is not the sort of thing that I'm talking about when I talk about the behavioural constellation of deprivation, but I think this happens at all levels of society in much more subtle ways. And it's probably cumulative as well. Being lower SES also means that you might live in quite a deprived neighbourhood, and that by definition, if you don't have the money to move out of that neighbourhood, there are things about it that are beyond your control. This can involve general neighbourhood disorder and being surrounded by other people who might do unpredictable things. It can involve poor housing quality, in this case, living in a very mouldy property, and it can involve having less control and less predictability in terms of your living conditions. So perhaps you're renting and you might be evicted at any moment. So this low personal control means that actually things that you might invest in now for a payoff in the future, for you at lower SES, you can ensure that for yourself to a lesser extent. And this is just a slide really to show you that I'm not making this up. There's a really large body of literature that shows that people of lower SES have both lower perceived and actual control over their life circumstances. And there's quite a cool experiment manipulating sort of perceived collection risk. So this is a kid and colleagues brought children into a lab. They had an experimenter who would, in a control condition, behave normally, and in the experimental conditions would behave unreliably and would allow the children to witness them being unreliable. They then found that subsequently children were much less able to delay gratification on the classic marshmallow test, which indicates that if they perceive that there is less likelihood of receiving a future reward, then they're less likely to be willing to wait. Now, how does this extend to the evolutionary perspective that Coralie's been talking about and to our behavioural constellation? Well, I like to use a specific example, which Coralie has already mentioned a little bit, which is about control over mortality risk. The reason we use this example is a few different things. One is that it's a really final example. If you are dead, you are not going to be able to cash in on any of your investments in the present because you're not around to see the payoff. In addition to that, there are also extrinsic mortality risk is a thing that has been very well modeled in evolutionary biology. We have a lot of understanding about it as a variable, and there are lots of models that we can draw on to make conceptual transfer to looking at behavior. I would like to say at this point, because this is a really common misunderstanding in the commentaries on this paper, I am not saying that extrinsic mortality risk is the only factor in limiting people's future outcomes. It is just one that's really easy to grasp because it is so very final and definite. So it makes a good example. And I'd like to point out before I move on to explain the evolutionary models about mortality risk that there are known socioeconomic gradients in exposure to things beyond individual control that can increase your mortality risk. And here's a list that is not by any means a complete list, but just some good examples. So we know that people in lower SES neighbourhoods are more exposed to environmental smoke, tobacco smoke and air pollution. They're more exposed to lead in water and from other building sources. They're also more likely to live in unsafe working and housing conditions. And I've just put as a random example here a news story from the UK about how building sites are unsafe. Now, the reason that this is interesting is actually just because one of the ways that we classically define social class is by occupation, with manual labour on such building sites being the way that you become low SES by that definition. In addition, I think the issue of violence is really interesting. So there's a paper by Shaw and colleagues that showed that in the UK in the year 2000, people who were in the poorest 10% of society had five-fold the homicide risk of those in the top 10%. So that's quite a big difference in risk due to just one factor, which is homicide. And why would this be important, this lack of control over what might kill you? Well, here we go to the evolutionary literature, and I'm going to, in particular here, use disposable soma theory, which is about the evolution of aging, as an example. So, disposable soma theory posits that organisms need to optimize their allocation of metabolic resources between three key things. These things are growth, reproduction, and somatic maintenance, so cellular repair. Now, One of the key assumptions of disposable soma theory is that somatic effort is traded off against reproduction. So there's an idea that there are physical limits on how you can allocate your resources, particularly in terms of energy, and that what is allocated to reproduction cannot be entirely allocated to physical repair. And under these conditions, if there is any death due to extrinsic causes, now in disposable soma theory, extrinsic is defined as outside of the body. If there's any risk of death due to, say, let's say natural disaster or predation, that is something that physical somatic repair cannot prevent. Therefore, if there is a high rate of extrinsic mortality risk, somatic investment is wasted because it could be spent on reproduction. Thus, we find that perfect repair should not be selected for, evolutionarily speaking, and aging should evolve. So, what does this tell us about the behavioural constellation of deprivation? So my co-author, Daniel Nettle, in 2010, put together a sort of simple mathematical model that made this distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic, borrowed from disposable soma theory, and applied it to behaviour. So if you imagine that your intrinsic risks are those things that you can alter, that you can reduce by altering your behaviour, and your extrinsic risks are things that you cannot control as an individual. No matter what you do, these are risks that are going to increase your mortality. Then you can see that classic health behaviours, like the ones I talked about on my earlier slide, are things that are going to add to your intrinsic risk of mortality. And those hazards, such as living in a dangerous neighbourhood or working in a dangerous workplace, that are less controllable to the individuals in question, are things that are going to contribute to your extrinsic mortality risk. Now, what Daniel did in his model was he assumed a relatively weak trade-off between health behaviour, which you can see here on the y-axis, and between other things that might increase your fitness, your evolutionary fitness. And assuming a relatively weak trade-off, and in fact, quite realistic levels of extrinsic mortality risk, so this is from sort of 0 to 4%. What he showed was that you can get quite a drop in what is the optimal health behaviour to perform. And one of the key points that he made then, he went on to make here in panel B, is that you can then see that as the primary effect of extrinsic mortality increases, so does the secondary effect of the reduction in health behaviour, which increases intrinsic mortality, giving you an additive effect whereby total overall mortality risk increases. So essentially you can get a twofold effect whereby extrinsic mortality risk drives reduced health behaviour, which actually then increases total mortality risk. So a few years ago now I went out and tested this with some observational evidence. I surveyed 600 Americans and found that amongst them, those of lower socioeconomic status felt that they had less control over their personal mortality risk, and they also reported making less effort to look after their health behaviour. And furthermore, what I found was that those who that association between socioeconomic status and health behaviour, which we classically see time and again in the public health literature, in this data set was completely mediated by people's perception that there's something beyond their control that might kill them. Just to drive that home in terms of what the effect size looks like in the model, I like to represent the key variables in the model in terms of just areas of a circle. So what we found was a really negligible effect of age, but this is a classic covariate that's used in such models. Again, a negligible effect of sex. SES actually had no effect once we put extrinsic mortality risk into the model, and neither did income, which is surprising because these are the things that are repeatedly found to be associated with effort in looking after health. Perceived intrinsic mortality risk had a sort of like tiny effect really there again. But extrinsic mortality risk, that perception that there is something beyond your control that might kill you, that you can do nothing about with health behaviour, that was an enormous factor in terms of predicting health effort in this particular set of people. But this was an opportunity sample. It was not necessarily population representative. In addition to this, this is just a correlation. This is not necessarily a causal thing. So we also did some experimental work. This is just one of 3 studies that are in this paper. But what I did was I exposed people to a fake life expectancy calculator. So I asked them, you can't see very well here, so I'll tell you what this says. I asked them how old they were, their gender, and their current postcode. And then they got given some feedback on the screen about how long people like them were living and what people like them were dying of. And what we did, don't worry, afterwards everybody was fully debriefed. They didn't go away believing any of this at the end. But what we did was we had 5 conditions, and we customized the feedback that they got on the screen. So it was, people of your age, insert age here, people of, males of your age in your postcode area, and we fed back their own information to them on the screen to make it feel more believable. We had a control condition where they didn't get any feedback about what their life expectancy would be. We had an uncontrollable long life condition. So in this case, we were saying people like you in your area are living, I think it was 13 years longer than the average was what we chose. And it's due to uncontrollable factors like reductions in pollution and violent crime. In uncontrollable short life, we used pollution and violent crime still, but we said people are living 13 years fewer than average. Controllable long life, again, we said people are living 13 years longer than average in your demographic, but it's due to health behaviors, it's due to individual behaviors. Controllable short life, we told people they're living 13 years fewer, and due to, again, to individual health behaviors. So we have 2 dimensions. We have whether or not something is controllable in terms of the cause of mortality, and we have the length of life effect. Then what we did was we went on to ask them to make a simple choice that represents health behavior, and in this case it was the choice between a box of organic fruits and a box of chocolates. Both of these were worth £11, so of equal value, and we made sure that they knew that. And what we found, just to say it briefly, is that the people who were in the controllable conditions, so both controllable long life and controllable short life, there was an increase in their tendency to choose fruit instead of chocolate. The uncontrollable conditions in the control treatment, it was both about half and half. Now that I've given you a little bit of the evidence towards this idea that mortality risk might be important for behavior, I'm going to talk about the feedback and feed-forward processes. So one of the things that's really useful in the evolutionary models of aging that, again, we can transfer to our understanding of health behavior is that there are these feedback loops. Now, this is something that is just quite a simplistic kind of diagram, but it'll give you the idea. So if you have high total extrinsic mortality risk, you might expect people to decrease their investment in health behavior and potentially also to do less physiological repair. This will actually increase intrinsic mortality risk, which thereby increases total mortality risk. So this is the same thing you saw on the earlier slide, just depicted differently. But then what is not depicted on the earlier slide in the model that I told you about is that potentially once some of this failure to invest in health behavior and physiological repair has happened, it may be irreversible. So at one time step, if you have failed to take care of your health, if you have failed to repair damage, then perhaps a small proportion of that becomes extrinsic. Because you cannot recover it, it is now beyond your control, and that increases extrinsic mortality risk. Given that, we would expect an increase in total mortality risk here, and also a feedback loop whereby this further incentivizes health behavior and physiological repair. Given this kind of dynamic, we could expect that if we had 2 individuals who started out in different early life environments, one with higher extrinsic mortality risk that you can see here, and one with low, this individual would invest less potentially in physiological repair and health behavior at the first time point, while this individual invests more. Imagine then that we move them into an identical environment at a later time point, but there's a tiny difference between them in terms of levels of extrinsic mortality risk that is not from the external environment, but from the fact that they invested less in their health at the original time point, or more in their health at the original time point. This would then be amplified by the same feedback loop that I've showed you earlier, and could lead, even when we've evened out this discrepancy experienced in earlier life, to a later life inequality that becomes more visible as time goes on. And this is actually something that we do see in the literature and that came up in the questions earlier, which is that you seem to get this embedding of early life, that somehow experiences in early life seem really important for adult outcomes, even actually when sometimes the environment in the middle is pretty similar. So this is just one way in which that could happen. It's very much a simplistic toy model, but it's about getting across the concept. Now, in the paper, we talk very much not actually about adaptive behavior, and this is a question that came up for Coralie, but about contextually appropriate responses. Now, the reason we didn't want to say that the behavioral constellation of deprivation is an adaptation is because it may not in fact be adaptive. It may be that being more present-oriented, if your information is correct, if your estimation about your extrinsic mortality risk is correct, then it may be adaptive. But it is possible that due to all sorts of things like adaptive lag and like skewed perceptions, perhaps generated by the media, and I'll talk again about this later, that in fact it's not an adaptive response, but a contextually appropriate one. And the reason we came to using the term contextually appropriate was because we didn't want to use logical or rational. For some people, particularly psychologists, this implies a conscious reasoning process, and there may not be, in the case of all these behaviors, conscious reasoning. We didn't want to use the word optimal, because although in behavioral ecology, when we model something, we talk about optimal. For some people, the word optimal implies a value judgment about behavior, and I don't want to say that being present-oriented is suboptimal, because actually I don't want to place a value judgment on present-oriented behaviors. So what we talk about in the paper is this idea that something is contextually appropriate, and what I mean is that it is understandable given the context that people find themselves in. In this case, I wouldn't expect this gentleman here, in the context that he is in, which is in the trenches, to be particularly worried about the future consequences of lighting that pipe. I think it's understandable that he wants to have a smoke at this point. Now, because we're talking about decision-making at different scales, I think it's really important to highlight an important distinction that we do talk about a lot in this paper, which is the ultimate proximate distinction. This is really commonly used in behavioral ecology and the evolutionary sciences, but not so much in other sciences about decision-making. Now, what this distinction is that there are a couple of different levels of explanation that we can use. Everything I've talked about so far in terms of this sort of why we might evolve to invest less in the present under high mortality risk is an ultimate explanation. So that's about why it is that we can expect a greater payoff for a given behavior in a given context. However, there are lots of things that you might call approximate explanation. Now, these might be about the neurological mechanisms involved. They might be about the decision-making and the learning processes involved. These are not ultimate explanations, but proximate. They're about how the behavior is delivered. So just to give a simple example, this table is from a paper by Scott Phillips and colleagues, and it's excellent. I really recommend it. But a good, clear example is about an infant crying. So the ultimate reason that an infant cries is because that will elicit defensiveness from caregivers, which will enhance survival. That's an ultimate explanation. So it's about why does that behavior happen universally in all infants in a given context. But then the proximate explanation for this might involve triggers, such as being cold or being hungry or being separated from a caregiver. It may involve neurological explanations. It may involve, for example, endogenous opioids, endocrinological explanations. So although the paper majors on ultimate explanations, we do review some of the potential proximate mechanisms, and I'm just going to very briefly touch on those, only really to say that there's not a lot of evidence, at least in neuroscience. So there is one review that we cite that shows that there are structural differences in the brain with socioeconomic status. And there have been 1 or 2 studies that have shown functional differences in the brain. So for example, there's a study here that shows that there are differences in amygdala reactivity in response to threatening faces, and that parental socioeconomic status of the participants can predict this. Having said this, there are very, very few studies that actually look at the neural correlates of behaviors in what I have called the behavioral constellation of deprivation, which is this very specific set of behaviors that center around time preference, or trade-offs between present and future. So I think there's actually like a really rich vein of work to be done here. Also, there are possible physiological mechanisms that are not neurological or neural correlates of behavior. And a lot of these are probably around stress responses. And the reason I sort of listed a few of the potentials here, which are all reviewed by Miller and colleagues, and the reason I mention them is that they actually also give this fantastic definition of what is stress. They define stress as an umbrella term meant to capture times when a person has been exposed to a stimulus and judged it to be a threat that he or she cannot manage. As such, you could view the behavioural constellation of deprivation as a behavioural stress response that might well be mirrored or underpinned by a lot of these physiological stress responses here. And in fact, telomere shortening is something I'm working on at the moment. So what are the implications of this? Because it's important that we think about the policy level, particularly. That's the scale we're interested in today, I'm told. And so one of the implications is that what we view as impulsive behaviours may be in fact understandable responses to context. So not necessarily about a deficit, a lack of self-control, or some kind of neurological deficit. It's in fact an understandable response. Also, there are traits such as locus of control, so perceived control over things, and temporal discounting that are often treated as though they're personality traits that are fixed in an individual that might in fact be a response to environment. Now, if people are in fairly stable environments over time, then it would be difficult to track this and it would end up looking like a personality trait. But in fact, they could be flexible responses. And also that, so we see a lot of interventions, and I think, again, Coralie touched on this earlier, that are designed particularly around education and health to try and reduce impulsivity or to increase people's tendency to think about the future. But these don't tend to work very well, and I think it's because they are isolated behavioural interventions rather than actually going into someone's environment and changing the factors that are causing them to be impulsive in the first place. There's the potential for a twofold effect here. So if we were to tackle extrinsic mortality risks for people, we might see a spontaneous increase in health behaviour. So from a policy perspective, we might do better to focus on some of the structural issues that increase people's extrinsic mortality risk rather than just persistently tell people they shouldn't smoke and drink. There's also the possibility that some of what I've talked to you today explains why many public health interventions can actually widen inequality. So it's quite a common thing that when, say, free screening treatment is offered, it's the worried wealthy well who preferentially take up those treatments, and the people who need it most who don't take it up. And it may be because, in fact, there's this disincentive due to a primary effect of extrinsic mortality risk to invest in taking up those behaviours or in fact acting on any kind of health advice. And therefore, by giving people extra health information that is then taken up by those who are well off, we'll see a widening of inequalities. As I said earlier, there's a possibility that perceptions are skewed. So particularly because of the way the media works these days, it's possible that we think that we overestimate, on average, our extrinsic mortality risk. And this is just a random example. This is about a panic that happened at Oxford Street in London because there was a fight and people thought there was a terrorist attack. Yeah, Oxford Street went nuts for a little while. But it's possible that also that people's perceptions of their extrinsic mortality risk are quite accurate. So if they're inaccurate, then adjusting perceptions would be good and everybody might behave healthier and invest more in the long term. But if they're accurate, perhaps we could perceive adjusting perceptions as the unethical course of action. So what should we do there? It also has implications for the design of public health interventions and campaigns like this one. So if you're a young person in London and you think that you are actually at high risk of being stabbed, perhaps because you live in a neighbourhood with a lot of gangs, then knowing that 400 people on average a month are injured in knife attacks in London is potentially not going to have the effect that we hope as a designer of this campaign. Perhaps what it's going to do is lead you to go away, drink more, smoke more, and generally think, well, screw investing in the future. And that would definitely be a negative unintended consequence of what is actually otherwise a well-intentioned campaign to try and save lives. There's also the intriguing possibility that in correlation with all of these behaviours that I've been talking about, people might just be aging more rapidly. So simply the perception that your environment is not safe might lead you to age more quickly, especially if there's nothing that you can do about that unsafe environment and your exposure to it. And that's actually something that I'm working on at the moment. I'm looking at biomarkers of aging with respect to extrinsic mortality perceptions. Do I have time? Do I have time to go into the commentaries?
Yeah.
Okay. So just to touch on a couple of the responses to this article, I've given you most of the content now for the too long didn't read version. So this was a really interesting response that I really like, and I actually think we should adopt the perspective that Dorsa and Matthew put forward here. So what they basically said, I've put everything in terms of time perspective, in terms of this present-future trade-off, because that is what is classically done in life history theory and biological models of aging. What Dorsa and Matthew did was to say, well, hey, what about looking at this as a risk management response? Because then we can account for not only the present-oriented behavior, which is a response to perceived collection risk, but we can also account for a whole range of behaviors, including potentially cooperation and other behaviors that vary with SES, that are about managing risk. So that's a really interesting idea. I really like it. I also want to highlight the, well, some of you will know this response, response by Mellon colleagues, which I think was really interesting. So everything I've talked about so far is about the idea that collection risk, so the idea that you might never live to see the rewards, or that you might not get the rewards because of circumstances beyond your control, and that drives a tendency to not want to wait. But in this article, Mellon colleagues put forward a really nice thought experiment, which is to highlight the idea that it's not just about collection risk, but also about other things that you could be doing while you're waiting. So in this case, they've asked us to imagine that a farmer's participating in an economic study and is offered the choice between receiving a smaller amount, $1,000 now, or $2,000 in a month, and that actually it might be better, if you don't have expensive agricultural equipment, to take the $1,000 now, sow all your fields, make more money, and rather than wait for this larger amount, make a profit that way. So actually, it's not always a straightforward case that waiting gets you a better outcome, is essentially the point to take home from this. I think there's some other good things in this article, but this was just one I really wanted to point out. Also, Coralie, who you've just heard from, made a really important point that policymakers, on average, are biased as a group. They tend to be well-off, well-educated, people who are not lower SES, and therefore they tend to have biases about their perception of all sorts of things, including teen pregnancy, when is a good time to become pregnant, is it unintended, and that it's really important to remember that when we devise policies that are, for example, attempting to reduce teen pregnancy, that the people who are having teen pregnancies are not living in the same ecology as the policymakers who make those policies. Jeremy Fries, he's at Stanford University, made a similar point, or at least he pointed out that it's actually a bit weird the way that people in privileged environments behave. And he was saying, well, why shouldn't we be talking about the behavioural constellation of advantage? Because in fact, some of the sort of higher SES behaviours, like delaying reproduction until you don't do it at all, are really quite odd. So actually that's another way to think about it that I think is quite important. Also, I don't know if I have time now, I'm about to finish, but just to point out that there are a couple of really nice policy implications highlighted by some of my public health colleagues. This one by Gina Adams points out that there's such a thing as a low agency intervention, and in public health these are frowned upon because they're interventions in which the government or local public health come along and provide something which the recipient of the intervention doesn't actively engage with. And these things tend to be frowned upon because it seemed to be reducing choice. But according to Gene Adams, actually a lot of these low agency interventions are perfect because what they do is they make people more able, for example, by subsidizing healthy foods, to make the choices that they want to make without them having to use their own resources to do so. So actually those people who are lower SES, who are actually less incentivized to seek out the healthy option, will by default be doing this because it's a low agency intervention. So actually that's a sort of counterintuitive thing, but it's very interesting. Also Timothy Brezina, who inspired a lot of my thinking about the Target article, has written something about the applications of this to the criminal justice system in the US. So there are these Scared Straight programs that some of you may know of that are designed to deter people, young people in particular, from getting themselves into prison by telling them just how awful life in prison is. According to Timothy Brezina, he thinks that actually this might elicit a kind of delay discounting because you're painting a picture of a horrible, bleak future to them, and you're not giving them a healthy incentive, a positive alternative to think towards. So that's as much as I think I have time for. I'd like to thank Daniel Nettle, who's my collaborator, and the European ComStar grant that funded this work. And I don't know if we have time for questions.
Thank you. I'd like to touch on the relation between socioeconomic status and temporal sparking. So what I knew from before seemed to be that we see this as a stable behavior across life. And you seem to be suggesting this is more related to the SES. This status might be changing throughout life. Are you aware that the choice behavior is following these changes in socioeconomic status?
So there are actually relatively few studies that look at SES over time, and a lot of them, to my knowledge, unless there are new ones I don't know about, are using particularly weird cohorts, you might call them. They're usually university students from a relatively well-off demographic, so in a lot of cases, yes, their socioeconomic status might change, but not necessarily enough for us to detect differences. I think the other thing to point out is that, as I said right at the beginning of my talk, I'm not necessarily saying that it is socioeconomic status per se that is causing delay discounting. It is things that tend on average to be associated with socioeconomic status. So you might actually be a very wealthy person who has also somehow experienced quite an unstable, uncontrollable environment at times, or has perhaps had just a lot of bad luck and an unusually large number of bereavements in your life. There could be all sorts of things that might mean that someone is actually well off and still very impulsive. And I think it's not about necessarily SES per se, but about the ecology that tends to come with SES. Ooh.
I'm not sure if this is the same point as the issue about risk management you mentioned at the end, but I know that recently economists have sort of gotten interested in the problem that it can be difficult to tell the difference between time preferences and sort of amount preferences, which they call risk sensitivity. And I guess I wonder whether it's helpful to think about any of these issues in terms of attitudes about the utility of different amounts of wealth, right? So I mean, I care as much about 2 marshmallows as one. There's clean them, right? If I'm starving, as I'll go to a marshmallow. It's not impulsivity in the sense of having sharper time preferences as a thing about amounts, and I wonder if that perspective has any.
Yes, I think that's actually really important because there are a couple of things that I haven't talked about that are also common at low SES. And one of those things is that if you have a smaller income, even if you save a larger proportion of that, it's going to take longer for you to be able to buy anything meaningful with that. So there will be a point at which amount is really important as well, and sometimes it's really difficult to untangle these things because the way that we classically operationalize things like future discounting in the lab is to just give people straightforward choices between small amount now and large amount later. And of course that's not actually got a lot of ecological validity. In the real world we're making all sorts of decisions that vary on other dimensions as well, including amount. And I just think that's something. I've seen some nice behavioural economic papers that have started to crack it, but how to apply that to the messy reality I've been talking about is another thing.
I have a question about your personal opinion about whether the forecasting model of mortality. So you mentioned the impact of extrinsic mortality and the cascade effect this can have even if you go back to the same socioeconomic status later in life. But you haven't talked about the other hypothesis, which is that it's not just destroying your soma irreversibly, it's also giving you a cue potentially of your future environment. Is it because you don't think that this is a good hypothesis? In all honesty.
In all honesty. I actually do think that we must be to some extent using predictive cues. However, my co-author Daniel on this paper has written another paper in which he looked at models of whether or not what is known as a predictive adaptive response could evolve, and suggested that we actually need really, really strong autocorrelation between environments and a really high cue validity for that to be something that's adaptive. So, as this paper represents both our opinions, my personal opinion is I think there might be some sort of predictive forecasting using cues about the future. I think he would argue not.
I have a question as well. You already asked my question in the commentary. So you've been very shy about the question whether it's adaptive or not, but what's your personal opinion about it? Would you say that so is it really contextually appropriate in the current environment, or would you rather say that there's really a mismatch between people's psychology when they're poor and their environment, and that they are actually not behaving appropriately? Invest more in their children, or so.
Well, so I think there's probably a mismatch. And I think that largely because if you look at what Jeremy Fries would term the behavioural constellation of advantage, one of those things, as I mentioned earlier, is that some people actually defer reproduction for so long that they don't do it at all, even if actually perhaps they wanted to. If you ask them personally whether they would have liked to have had children, they'll say yes, but they put it off so long that it's sort of no longer possible. And that cannot be adaptive. But I think the true difficulty is that without intergenerational cohorts, where we have all of these interesting variables and we can look at whether or not people leave more descendants, it is really difficult to answer the question of whether these behaviours are adaptive. So it may become possible. We're starting to see more and more cohorts that have multiple generations, and it may be possible to start to look at these questions of whether or not these behaviours are adaptive. But I think certainly some of them are probably maladaptive byproducts of a tendency to become more impulsive under a certain environment, harsh environment.